Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I am delighted to have Clay doing a slightly belated opening talk.
It's actually good that I'm not doing an opening talk because I didn't have anything large and framing to say. In fact, I'm going to use this moment to talk about something that I've been puzzling through and haven't talked about in public yet. I can't think of a room of people I'd rather talk about it with. So I want to present something that I've been kind of grinding through and see what you guys think. And it starts from here. I have the big sort of change in my life in the last year has been that I've become a professor of journalism, which is exactly as improbable an event as it sounds. And I'm not a professor of journalism because I'm going to teach those students how to be journalists, which I could no more do than teaching them to be violinists, but because I'm trying to talk to people about what social media is like, which is one of the things transforming their landscape. And so I've spent a lot of time revisiting a conversation that has been core to the social media conversation, both within this community and in the public at large. Refocus. That 21st century ritual of the changing of the machines. Let's see, there we go. This question, which second perhaps only to information overload, has been one of those questions that can continually be re-asked in public. And I've been, as I've turned my attention to talking to journalists about social media, I've been revisiting this question, having set it aside, as I think a lot of us did for a while. So let's start here. Charlie bit my finger. The most watched minute of amateur video ever created. It's no Gangnam Style, but it does have 500 million page views. And here is the famous moment, the moment that makes this video compulsively watchable, the second insertion of the finger into Charlie's mouth. Without this, this video would be nothing. And here, so this is obviously running on YouTube, a large video sharing site you will have heard of, run by an even larger internet borg called Google that you will have heard of. Here's a much smaller site, Feminist. This is a blog for discussing feminist issues, and here is a conversation about Congress and rape and abortion, right? So if I went out and said to the average internet user, well, here's this cute video of these kids playing around that the parents took, and then here is this conversation about political polarization in the United States, rape and abortion, and on one of these sites, the comments were really horrifically dreadful. And on the other one of the sites, the comments were quite polite and engaged. Everybody would say, yeah, I get that. I understand why. Except that it's the reverse order. The YouTube comments are horrific. YouTube is like the basement of internet commenting. Whereas if you go and you look at the feminist comments, they're polite, they're threaded, they're thoughtful. People begin the sentences with those big letters, and they use the internet, they use the IP address dots to indicate the end of a thought. The whole thing, right, unfolds in this remarkably polite and engaged way, even when it's contentious, even when people are disagreeing, right? So you can't use content as one of the explanations for how come comments suck so bad, because plainly you would expect the contentious subject to be the one that generated the negative comments, and it isn't, right? It's the baby video. So maybe, right, maybe this is just a question of technical competence. Maybe one of these organizations is large and has an enormous number of resources. Engineering talent really gets the internet. And another one of these organizations is just a kind of a small, scrappy media outlet that's trying to make it. And that's true. But again, it points in the opposite direction, because if you ran into the street and grabbed anybody and said, quick, who's a rich company that gets the internet? Google would be on that list, and Jezebel would not be. And yet, on the Google site, the comments are terrible. And on the Jezebel site, they're not, right? So Google doesn't lack for any resources you would care to name to make comments on YouTube good, and yet they are not good, right? So there is some institutional bias here, separate from the demand side. Separate from both what the users want to do with each other or care about, and separate from what the software makes available, there is some third thing here that's making this comparison go in the opposite direction of what we might expect. So I want to offer up 3 of the various reasons people have talked about for why comments are sometimes poor, and re-examine them in the light not just of the kind of socio-technical bargains we often talk about, but also in terms of institutional bias, what institutions are capable of or not. So, explanation number 1, right? And your own daily life experience will doubtless confirm this. Right? These are useful. This is a useful explanation, and yet, although the world is populated by bitter, hateful trolls, feminist comments are not, right? So what is going on here? And the answer, fairly obviously, is that feminist is simply moderating harder than YouTube. They are letting fewer negative comments through. And I don't mean negative in the terms of disagreeing among the commenters, but people who simply want to shut the whole conversation down. Feminist just posts fewer of those comments. Compared especially to newspapers, which has been the area of my focus on this, in thinking through this institutional issue, newspapers often say, well, we have a higher degree of respect for the First Amendment. This is American papers. The First Amendment doesn't apply to American papers, but they metaphorically make the argument that respect for freedom of speech, respect for open comment posting is in line with American values. And so newspapers simply let more comments through than a place like Feminist does, and this is out of respect for the First Amendment. And that argument holds water right up until you get hold of the text of the First Amendment, because it does indeed protect freedom of speech and freedom of the press, but it also protects freedom of assembly. Right? So in fact, the big difference in the world is populated by bitter, hateful trolls, what will we do conversation is, do we regard commenting as being analogous to publishing, or do we regard commenting as being analogous to community membership? Which metaphorical frame inside the First Amendment an organization adopts has nothing to do with the technology under the hood. Almost any tool that's in modern use would allow for a high or a low degree of filtering. Right? It's just that the New York Times, the Daily News, the New York Post regard the public availability of words as being inherently like publishing, whereas Feminist is willing to regard that as being communal, as being like assembly. And so they say, we're going to remove the trolls because if we allow the trolls too much free rein, the community suffers. Right? And you can't actually adjudicate that by saying one of those ideas is more in keeping with the First Amendment than the other. What you're really saying is that wrong?
Yeah, I'm actually just protesting, mentally, I'm going, exactly the same problems are affecting newspapers around the world, and we are going to shit about the First Amendment. So, what's the relevance? Why are we framing it in that?
So I'm maybe framing it as the First Amendment because of this, because I'm an American looking at U.S. papers. But I think that anybody that commits to publicly available words is closer to publishing than community is going to be more likely to think of the commenters as publishers than as members of some group whose group nature needs to be protected.
That's a plausible argument, definitely.
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily frame it in terms of First Amendment, given that it's...
Fair enough, and I will not do that because, right, obviously given the international parallels. So let me say this instead. I think that the regarding of each commenter as a series of individual actors is in line with what the publishers are used to thinking about for making words public. Whereas thinking of a group of commenters being a community, you're then more willing to take steps to control it. Second explanation, good, big, cheap pick two, the famous trilemma of commenting, right? If you have a small group of commenters, right, then you can have good comments at very low moderation cost. You don't need to spend a lot of money. You don't need to spend a lot of time. You don't need to have a lot of complicated software because small groups tend to self-moderate, right? But when you look at YouTube, when you look at YouTube scale, plainly, what lawyers call an attractive nuisance, right? Plainly, the presence of 500 million page views is enough to bring people in who are saying, for a children's video, what the fuck did he expect, shoving a finger in his mouth, right? Not the kind of thing you'd ordinarily see. Years ago, on the Charlie Bit My Finger video, when Charlie Bit My Finger was #1 and Lady Gaga was #2, So many of the Gaga fans came in and were cursing out Charlie, his brother, and the parents, that they had to put a little thing on the top of the video that said, this is a family-oriented channel. Please stop leaving these comments on our video. Right? So this is a function of scale. Right? But again, if you take a publishing frame, right, anyone can reduce scale if you like, right? Just let fewer people in. But if you take a publishing frame, then maximizing your audience is what you want to do rather than maximizing the quality of your community. And so, although the people at YouTube will tell you, right, we wish we had good comments, what they really mean is we wish we had good comments given that we're absolutely committed to maximum scale at low cost. And given that this is a trilemma, it's not like they want good comments, because if they wanted good comments, they would do something about it. They wish they had good comments, which is to say, we don't want that trilemma to exist. We don't want to have to trade off comment quality versus scale and cost. But you do, right? And again, the institutional frame of maximizing page views is the thing that leads all of the social and technical solutions we have known and documented and lived with for decades not to be adopted in places like this. This is sort of ironic in the US context because the newspapers historically have prized themselves on something called the Chinese wall, which keeps the business side of the publication and the editorial side of the publication apart. Here, there is an absolute business decision about letting comments drift towards low quality because the people managing the comments don't sense themselves as being in the business of the content side of the paper, but rather maximizing page views. So they're willing to make that trade-off. You can see in Gawker's experiment, right? So here was a story that went up on Gawker. It was on Slashdot as well. You've probably seen this. The guy who was being paid by Verizon outsourced his job for 20% of his salary to China, took 80% of the money to watch cat videos all day long, and then was then rated the top employee, ironically, the top employee in the building, little did they know. So this went up on Gawker. It generated lots and lots of comments. And yet the Gawker comment thread is quite good, right? It's not as discussion-oriented as the feministing thread I showed you earlier. But what Gawker has done is it says, we're only going to show you 2 discussions. We don't care how many comments there are. We're only going to show you the top 2 discussions. And they're going to be rated by how many people are replying to one another and how much the people higher in the comment thread value the comments lower in the thread, right? And so this is a very high degree of veto power handed over to the users, right? Control handed from the site owners to the users in order to make these comments, work better. Right? The bottom of the Gawker comments are the usual one-liners and throwaways. It's not like the low-quality crap isn't in there. Gawker's just said, we have a site where anybody can say anything, but we're getting out of the business of guaranteeing that everybody will hear it. Right? And again, that isn't about the technology. The technology to do what Gawker is doing is relatively simple. Right? What this is about is the decision that the community and conversation are more important to the people hosting this site than actually trying to drive or maximize page views, which is to say to optimize for high scale and low cost, and then just wring your hands about quality. And then the third of the 3 explanations, almost no one working in an institution that solicits comments on a story could answer the question, what do you want the users to do? Right? In part because the real answer is we want them to forward this article to 1 million of their friends, and then we want them to shut up and read another article. Right? That's their actual goal. And when you look at the design of these sites, right? So here's the New York Times. Here's an article that ran actually today in the New York Times. When you get to the bottom, so please share this on Facebook, share this on Twitter, Google+, anything. Do anything except comment, and then comment if you must, right? And so the comment section is relegated to the bottom part of the page, often between a gulf of look at other articles on our site, look at other articles on someone else's site, anything else, and then finally, here is where you can comment. But share your thoughts is a really generic way of framing what it is they want the user to do. They don't say, do you know anything about this story? Has anything like this happened to you? What do you think the next outcome should be? What do you think Senate Republicans, House Democrats, whatever, should do? It's all just an open-ended framing, which invites something that reads very much, if you spend any time with the New York Comments, it reads like letters to the editor, which again, entirely within the institutional sense that the New York Times makes of user participation, right? They're not there to have a conversation with one another. They're there to annotate and react to our articles. But this bias in particular, what do you want the users to do, is even more extreme when you start imagining that the users actually can do things in the world, not just talk to each other. Right? So if I go onto the Times site and I am looking at Broadway shows, right? So here's a show called Anne. They tell me where it is. They'll give me the address. They'll give me the map. They'll tell me the date it previewed, the date it opens. They'll give me a closing date. If there is a closing date, and more show information, and buy tickets, a buy tickets button right there. Right? They're very eager to give me as much actionable information about this show as I can get. If you'd gone on last year and looked up Herman Cain under Times Topics, the rough equivalent of what they do for Broadway shows, they would not have pointed you to Cain's website. They would not have told you where to make a donation. They would have not have told you how to look up where the primary was in your state. They wouldn't tell you how to register. They wouldn't tell you who his opponents were. They wouldn't link to his positions. Nothing. Nothing. No actionable information at all. So newspapers make a big deal about their political importance to the citizenry. But when you look at what they're actually doing under the hood, they do a much better job and are much more engaged at helping consumers plug into the market than they are helping citizens plug into politics. And this isn't just about not wanting to be seen to be advocating because they're providing information. Right? Ben Brantley, the theater reviewer of the New York Times, hated Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark so much he will drive over to your house to personally convince you not to go. I mean, this review was legend. This is the first two sentences of the review. Merely boring, massive improvement, merely boring, right? Buy tickets, right? Buy tickets. They have no trouble at all making a distinction between this is our judgment and these are your options. But they never, ever do that for politics, or indeed any of the possible citizen actions we could take. And this isn't because of the technology. They do it every day, right? They do it every day in, David Poe's column. Here's where you buy this camera I'm just talking about, right? They do it every day in the theater section. Here's where you go to see the show, buy tickets. When they're talking about politics, and when you see what's possible using the newspaper platform, you realize how much this isn't just socio-technical on the demand side. This is really institutional bias on the supply side. In 2006, there was a famous grounding of aircraft in a rainstorm for 8 hours. People sat on the tarmac for 8 hours before the planes were allowed to take off again. And this happens fairly frequently. But this time, someone decided to do something about it. This woman, Kate Hanna, Relocate, who was a realtor in California. When she got home, she said, I am starting an organization to advocate for flyers' rights as of right now. And she created the Coalition for the Airline Passengers Bill of Rights, put it up in a WordPress blog, put up a little petition you could sign. And then she Googled that flight number. And every single newspaper that wrote about it, she would go and leave a comment in that paper. Her comments were often twice as long as the actual articles she was commenting on, and every time she left a comment, she said at the end, I've started this organization, go to this address, sign up, help us. So she used the newspaper platform to create citizen engagement. And weirdly, the newspapers were writing about this airplane thing because they wanted something to happen. They weren't just saying, Northwest kept people on the ground for 8 hours. Thought you'd like to know, right? Newspapers often argue for their relevance because of their political effect. And yet, the person who figured out how to use the newspaper platform to actually drive change, not just spread information, but to actually change things, was somebody working in the comments section, not the newspaper itself. So we can even see places where people like hermit crabs are adopting the frame that the newspaper provides to actually do something that plugs citizens into politics, not just consumers into markets. And yet the papers, because of their institutional bias, will never go there. So I've found this line of thinking quite depressing, because for years I'd adopted the theory I think many of us did watching traditional media companies wrestle with the internet, a theory that could maybe be compressed as those dumbheads theory, right? And the advantage of those dumbheads theory is when you see someone not doing something that seems like a good idea, you can say, oh, those dumbheads, if only someone would explain to them how much more flexible, how much more latitude they have in this platform, how much easier it is to create a good community, a good conversation, a good comment section, etc. I don't think that's what's happening. I think this is what's happening. That institutional bias, particularly as we're out of the world where social media is mainly done by startups and exists in a kind of parallel universe, and where large companies are almost all of them adapting to social media in one way or another, and especially publishing companies. I think that one of the big obstacles to them taking advantage of everything we know to be possible in this room is just a set of institutional biases, right? They just can't think of their commenters as a community whose right to assembly would potentially trump their existence either as individual publishers who are using this platform or as people generating cheap, low-cost page views. And if that's right, then we're going to see much less progress, particularly in the news media, because of the institutional biases. And I'll end there and open it up for conversation. And Elizabeth, I saw you nodding your head, so I'll get to you in a minute.
Yes. A company that I used to work for that I shall not name. Sarah Sood of Pomona College and I built some sentiment detection algorithms to go through news comics. And the idea was to basically just separate them out into happy, sad, angry, but actually modulate that by the original content and say there are some. So we did a lot of analysis, and I can give you the details. But there are some sites where there's a lot of anger, but there's real content, like political sites, sports sites, other sites where it might be less appropriate. And so we tried to actually get somebody to put some of these algorithms to work. And what we wanted to do was not censor people, but maybe do some of the reordering. Impossible to get it taken up. Just not seen as a priority. Because the actual conversation around the content was less prioritized in terms of putting the algorithms in than some of the more content matter around advertising that we also worked on.
Right.
And so I just wanted to really strongly agree with you.
And some of that is, again, this tendency. Sorry, this tendency to this tendency to think of themselves as separating content and business, except when it comes to this sort of conversation. Yes, Tom.
Well, I think actually that's where I wanted to come in first. Like, having worked at publishing organisations like Time Out, and still I think this is true even in places as sort of adept as the New York Times. The way the internet arm starts is as the way of creating money around the content produced somewhere else on the internet. So the New York Times writes the content. The team at the internet is there to take that content, put it online, and stick it out. So anything that you see on the web that fundamentally is about like greater engagement, which is about that buy button, it's got nothing to do with the editorial, the writer of that thing saying like, here is a brilliant article, dismissing this kind of terrible play. Now you should go and buy a ticket. The author is probably horrified by that. Normally, the author of the articles, the writer, is just dismally depressed by the kind of little buttons stuffed around their stuff online. But that's why they don't care about the politics stuff generally, because it's just, that's not the remit of that team. The remit of that team is take our content, make money of it, so that when the press goes down, when people finally stop buying the bloody newspaper, we can still actually have some people writing. Now, that being the case, some of the other stuff you're saying I think is completely right. I'm totally on board with. And it's that element of like conversation and response that an organization prompts you and just says, like, respond to the article. There's no response between the people implied. Having said that, what you said about New York Times, the way they frame it is pretty much exactly the way that Gawker tends to frame things. Like, see things in response to this article, although there is a little bit more discussion. I think one of the things we dismiss a lot, particularly at scale, is cultural norms, is the development of a group of people who have a discussion and debate things. Any site with a certain limited number of people will gradually develop a core group of commenters, a core group of people that use it more actively and more generally, and they will try and police to some extent the kind of conversations going on, as well as setting good examples. When you've got something like YouTube, someone on the back channel just said, it's basically a public bathroom. Right. People stride down the street, they pop in, they go, well, it's not my bathroom, I don't really care what happens in it. You know, like, they just do something, go off and find somewhere else. Where if it's a place that they've got an investment in, I think actually that's profoundly difficult for very large companies to get their heads around, particularly when you launch something at scale, because you can't build that culture. Facebook, Twitter, Blogger, all of them started small, and the press don't have that option. So I mean, I give them some limited kind of defense on that basis. It's fucking hard, they're not good at it. We got Matt.
So what is your ideal comment situation? Like, could you sort of elucidate what that looks like?
I have a fantasy world in which there is a dashboard and an editorial role, which makes it appear fantasy, because no one will ever hire anybody to do this, in which every comment section is sculpted to the article. So someone can say, encourage threading, so we get more conversation, or encourage letterboxing, so we get more annotation, right? Someone says, here's a framing question that goes in between. What I was trying to show here when Tom was talking about Gawker, you can't see it because I took the screenshots wrong, but there is literally nothing between the end of the article and the beginning of the discussion. And so they don't have that, please tweet, please Facebook, if you must comment, go down here. But I would love to, so as an exercise, I give my students big picture, the Boston Globe photojournalism site, and often the big picture that is up is around a disaster. And I say, take these photos, ignore what the Boston Globe did, design an interface. And not one of the student groups ever misses the option to put a donate button if it's a disaster. Never misses it. I never mention it. I don't hint at it. They all come to it independently. If you could see a picture of a disaster, put a donate button. The Boston Globe would never do that. So my fantasy is that the range of things that people are even able to think about inside publishing companies is much larger, and they have a kind of dashboard in which they say, I'm going to inject this piece for this story and that piece for that story. It's a kind of editorial judgment.
So would commenting be, so this is a big thing of commenting, would it be, and Facebook is trying to solve this by throwing people's real names on its module, so would you have anonymous commenting?
For small values of solve, but yes.
So, and how do you sort of strike the balance between like anonymous commenting and throwing people's real names on there? And this is something Gawker is wrestling with the new system in part, like all of these things, because you have the burner accounts, you have the verified ones, and then you have with Kinja the sort of the moderation where you have these things float to the top, and that's going to be like even more involved.
So the real name thing mainly works to drain the worst, but it doesn't do so much to either encourage the best kind of interactions, and again, best within a sort of per article context. It also doesn't do enough to recognize that users have all kinds of agency, of which typing is only one. And that's something I'd like to see come into these publications. I'm told I have time for one more question, and Neil had his hand up.
Why do we ascribe this to ignorance and not malice? Right? Like, aren't traditional media organizations very well served by making their readers look dumber? So there's two pieces to this. One of which is the institutions are arrogant and therefore serve well when they communities. And the other part is the technologists who create the tech that makes good communities are also arrogant, where they'll say, well, this clues people the time should figure all this out, and we shouldn't have to do anything to encourage them to use our tools.
I'll disagree with you on the second point, because there's hardly anybody who's made a tool that makes conversation at least more interesting. Discus, branch, talk, whatever the long list that we all know. Who would love to sell to the New York Times? So I'm not sure that there's...
Would love to sell versus doing the work to accommodate their culture are two different things. This is the
Fair
whole
enough.
conversation earlier.
Fair enough. Yes. All right. But the ignorance and malice thing, I mean, you know, it's funny. It's one of my assumptions is never ascribed to malice what can be explained by ignorance. So that's just an a priori assumption I've got. I don't think that individually the people making, I mean, you know, Tom's story about this arising out of the advertising department, I don't think the people making the individual choices are saying, let's keep the comments annotative, let's make sure conversation doesn't form, let's make sure that the user can't use this as a platform for collective action. I don't think that it's an affirmative set of choices. I think they're saying that letters to the editor, this feels like letters to the editor, which is kind of a comfortable place for us to be. I may be wrong, right? It may be that a dozen years into this revolution, 15 years into this revolution, that these places have now set up fairly formal conversations around preventing collective action from taking place.
Because every tech platform does that too, right? So every social software platform tries to prevent collective action of the users taking control over the user experience. Facebook doesn't want you to rebel against the newsfeed change, right? So these are not that old.
And therefore they cancel the votes.
Therefore they cancel the votes. So aren't the media doing the same things?
That's interesting. I don't know, but it's an interesting thought, I think. Thank you for this.
Thank
Thank you all.